Los Angeles, California. The Lee family home, 1993. 20 years after Bruce Lee died, his family made a phone call that nobody expected. A phone call that confused people. A phone call that, when the full story came out, made grown men sit in silence and stare at the wall. They called Steven Seagal. Not Jackie Chan, not Jet Li, not any of the legendary martial artists who had trained alongside Bruce, who had carried his legacy forward, who had spoken at tributes and bowed before his photograph. They called Steven Seagal, the Hollywood action star, the man with the ponytail, the man half the martial arts world had quietly dismissed for years. Why him? Why that man of all people? The answer involves a story that almost no one knows, a secret that the Lee family kept for 2 decades, a debt that was never publicly acknowledged, and a moment in a hospital room in 1972 that changed the relationship between two men who were never supposed to meet. This is that story. First, you need to understand something about Bruce Lee that the movies always get wrong. Bruce Lee was not just a fighter. He was not just a philosopher. He was not just a movie star. He was a father, a husband, a man who worried about money, about his children's future, about what would happen to his family if something happened to him. He told his wife Linda this once, sitting in their kitchen in Bel Air in 1972, about a year before he died. Linda remembered it her whole life. He said, "The thing that keeps me awake at night is not my enemies. It is not the people who challenge me or disrespect me or want to prove something. The thing that keeps me awake is the question of who will protect the people I love when I am no longer here to do it." Linda told him he was being dramatic. He was 31 years old. He was the most physically capable man she had ever known. He was about to become the most famous martial artist in history. Nothing was going to happen to him. She was wrong. And somehow, somewhere in the part of him that understood danger more deeply than most people ever would, Bruce Lee already knew she was wrong. He died on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. Brandon was 8, Shannon was 4, and Linda Lee was alone with 2 young children, a complicated legacy, and a world that was about to go absolutely crazy over her dead husband. Here is what most people do not know about what happened after Bruce Lee died. The fame did not slow down, it exploded. Enter the Dragon had just been released. The whole world was discovering Bruce Lee at exactly the moment he was no longer alive to deal with what that discovery meant. His face was everywhere. His voice was everywhere. His philosophy was being quoted, misquoted, stolen, commercialized, turned into products, turned into posters, turned into cheap imitation films with other Asian actors pretending to be him. And into this chaos came the opportunists. Some wanted money. Some wanted rights to his name and image. Some wanted to claim they had been his student, his friend, his secret confidant. There were lawsuits. There were false stories. There were people showing up at Linda's door making demands and telling lies. There were also threats. This is the part of the story that has never been fully told in public. Linda Lee has spoken about it in careful, measured terms over the years. She has never given full details. But people who were close to the family during that period, people who were there, have said the same thing in private for decades. In the years immediately following Bruce's death, the Lee family was not safe. Not because of one specific organized threat, but because of the general chaos of that moment. Money was involved, lots of money, rights and royalties and licensing deals that were worth millions of dollars. And when millions of dollars are involved, and a widow is alone with two small children, and the legal system is slow and complicated, certain kinds of people see opportunity. Linda needed someone who could actually do something. Not a lawyer, though she had lawyers. Not a publicist, though she had those too. She needed someone who was physically capable, whose presence communicated a message that did not need to be spoken out loud. Someone who trained seriously. Someone who understood violence not as entertainment, but as a real thing that happened to real people. She did not call a Hollywood martial artist. Hollywood martial artists, with a few exceptions, were performers. They could do beautiful things in front of a camera. That was not the same thing. She needed someone real. Steven Seagal in 1973 was not famous. He was not even slightly famous. He was 20 years old and he was living in Japan. This is the part of Seagal's story that people always skip because it is not glamorous or cinematic. Before the movies, before the ponytail, before the controversy that would follow him for decades, there was this period, this quiet, serious, unglamorous period where a young man from Michigan went to Japan and trained. He trained in Aikido, not casually, not the way some Americans went to Japan and took a class twice a week and then came home and put a certificate on their wall. He lived there. He immersed himself. He trained under masters who did not care about Hollywood or fame or whether you were comfortable or whether the training was convenient. Aikido is not a fighting style that looks impressive to people who don't understand it. It does not have flying kicks. It does not have powerful strikes. It's about control. It's about redirecting force. It's about using your opponent's energy against them rather than meeting it with your own. Sound familiar?
This is what connected Bruce Lee and Steven Seagal before they ever met in person. Not the movies, not the fame, not the industry, the philosophy. The deep, genuine belief that real martial arts was not about how hard you could hit someone. It was about understanding movement, balance, and the geometry of force. Bruce Lee had arrived at this through Wing Chun and through the philosophy he was developing that would become Jeet Kune Do. Seagal arrived at it through Aikido and years of training in Japan. They came from different traditions, they came from different cultures, but they were pointing at the same thing. There's a story, and this story is told by people who knew both men, that Bruce Lee and Seagal met once, just once, in 1972. Bruce was visiting Japan for reasons connected to his film career. Seagal was teaching Aikido in Osaka, at the dojo he would eventually become the first foreigner to run in Japan. The meeting was not arranged. It was not formal. It happened the way real things often happen, by accident, in a context nobody anticipated. Someone who knew both men brought them together at a small dinner, 6 people total, a table in a private room of a restaurant in Osaka. Bruce Lee, at 31 years old, at the absolute peak of his physical and philosophical development. Steven Seagal, at 19, young and serious, and not yet sure what his life was going to become. Bruce arrived late. He was often late in those years, not from rudeness, but from the impossible demands on his time. He sat down, was introduced around the table, and within 15 minutes had asked Seagal a question that nobody else at the table expected. He said, "Show me something." Not "show me your Aikido," Not demonstrate your technique, just show me something. And what Seagal showed him in the small space between their chairs, with no preparation and no performance, was enough. The details of what happened at that dinner table are not fully known. The people who were there have told pieces of it over the years, and the pieces are consistent enough to trust. Bruce Lee asked Seagal to resist a movement. Seagal resisted. Bruce applied pressure from a different angle, a very small pressure, precise and quiet, and Seagal found himself unable to continue resisting without restructuring his entire body position. He restructured. Bruce applied the same pressure from a new angle, anticipating exactly where Seagal would go. Seagal restructured again. Bruce was already there again. It lasted maybe 40 seconds. It was not a fight. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was threatened. But at the end of it, Seagal understood something he would spend the rest of his life trying to fully articulate. Bruce Lee was not doing technique at him. He was reading him. He was several moves ahead, not in a chess sense, but in a deeper sense. He understood how Seagal was organized physically. He understood the patterns of how Seagal had been trained to respond. He was not defeating the technique. He was defeating the assumptions underneath the technique. Bruce Lee looked at the young American across the table and said something that Seagal has only quoted once in a private conversation years later. He said, "You understand the principle. Most people only learn the form. The form is just a shape. The principle is alive. You have the principle. Don't let anyone teach it out of you." They talked for 2 more hours. Seagal was mostly quiet, which was not his nature even then. But this was a different situation. This was not a conversation where Seagal had anything to add. This was a situation where listening was the only intelligent response. They exchanged information, agreed to meet again. Bruce flew back to Hong Kong 2 days later. They never met again. A year later, Bruce Lee was dead. Seagal heard the news in Japan. He has talked about this moment briefly, and when he talks about it, his voice changes in a way that people who have interviewed him notice, even if they do not comment on it. He said he sat with it for a long time, not in a dramatic way, in the way you sit with the news that something important has been permanently removed from the world. He was 20 years old. He had met the man once, but that one meeting had been one of the most significant conversations of his life, and now the man was gone, and the conversation was over. He went to the dojo and trained for 4 hours. That was how he processed it. He stayed in Japan. He continued training. He continued teaching. Years passed. And then, in 1993, his phone rang. It was not Linda Lee who called directly. It was someone connected to the family, a trusted person in their circle, who made the initial contact. The message was simple. The family needed someone to come to a meeting. There was a situation involving Brandon Lee, who had just died. Brandon Lee died on March 31st, 1993. He was 28 years old. He was shot on the set of The Crow by a bullet that should not have existed, a fragment left in a gun barrel from a previous incident, a catastrophic and still not fully explained failure of basic safety procedures. The world was in shock. The parallel was too painful, too obvious, too mythologically heavy to ignore. Father and son, both young, both at the threshold of the full realization of what they could become, both gone before the story was finished. And in the middle of the family's grief,
In the middle of the legal chaos and the media chaos and the industry chaos that followed Brandon's death, someone connected to the production was making noise that the family found threatening. Not physically threatening necessarily, legally threatening, financially threatening. The kind of threatening that is designed to take advantage of grief and confusion and the complexity of what happens when a young man dies unexpectedly on a film set, and there are contracts and insurance policies and rights and responsibilities that all suddenly need to be sorted out. Linda Lee and Shannon Lee needed someone in the room, someone whose presence communicated clearly that the family was not alone, that there were people behind them who were serious people, that the grief did not mean vulnerability. The person they called was Steven Seagal. By 1993, Seagal was famous. Above the Law had come out in 1988. Hard to Kill, Marked for Dead, Under Siege. He was one of the biggest action stars in the world. But more importantly, from Linda's perspective, he was someone who had known Bruce. Someone who took the martial arts seriously in the way Bruce had taken it seriously. Someone who, unlike many of the people around the family, was not there because of the business opportunity. He came. He sat in the meeting. He said very little. He did not need to say anything. His presence was the message. The situation resolved. The details are private and have stayed private, but it resolved. And afterward, Shannon Lee, who was 24 years old and had just lost her brother 2 months after losing her father 20 years before, sat with Seagal for a while, just the two of them, and she asked him about her father.
She asked if he had really known him, not just met him. And Seagal told her about the dinner in Osaka, about the 40 seconds at the table, about what her father had said to him about the principle underneath the form. Shannon Lee has said in interviews over the years that she thinks about her father every day. She has said that the people who knew him, the ones who truly knew him, share something that cannot be faked, a specific quality of remembering, a specific way of describing what it was like to be in his presence. She said Seagal had that quality. She could hear in the way he spoke about her father that the memory was real. There is a larger question underneath this story that is worth sitting with for a moment. Why don't we know this? Why is this not the famous version of the Steven Seagal story? Why, when people talk about Seagal, does the conversation immediately go to the controversy, the weight, the movies that did not age well, the claims about him that have circulated for years? Part of the answer is that the controversy is louder. Controversy always is. The quiet thing, the true thing, the thing that happened in a private room in 1993 or at a dinner table in Osaka in 1972, that does not make noise the way scandal makes noise. Part of the answer is that Seagal himself has never told this story fully in public. He has mentioned pieces of it. He has confirmed that he knew Bruce Lee, that they met, that the meeting mattered to him, but he has not told the whole story. And the reason is probably simple. It is a private thing. It belongs to him and to the Lee family and to the people who were in those rooms. And part of the answer is that we have a very limited idea of who Steven Seagal is. We have the image, the ponytail, the movies, the controversy. We do not have the young man in Japan. We do not have the serious student who trained under masters and became the first foreigner to run an Aikido dojo in Japan. We do not have the person who answered the phone when the Lee family called. Bruce Lee understood something about this. He said it many times in different ways.
He said that people see the surface and mistake it for the whole thing. They see the shape and think they understand the principle. They see the performance and think they are watching reality. He was talking about martial arts, but he was talking about everything. Shannon Lee runs the Bruce Lee Family Company today. She has spent decades protecting her father's legacy, deciding what is real and what is not, deciding who had access to who her father truly was and who was simply projecting their own version of him onto his image. She has said that this work is harder than most people realize. Everyone wants Bruce Lee. Everyone wants a piece of what he meant, what he stood for, what he proved with his life and his work and his philosophy. And the challenge is to hold on to what was real in the middle of all that wanting. The call to Seagal was part of that work, not in a public way, not in a way that was designed to be known or celebrated, just in the way that real things get done, quietly, practically, by calling the right person and trusting that they will show up. He showed up. That is the story. There is a detail that comes back to the beginning and connects everything. Bruce Lee in Osaka in 1972, at the end of that dinner, stood up to leave and said something to the group. It was directed at everyone, but the people who were there always felt it was directed particularly at the young American who had been quiet all evening. He said, "The people who will protect what matters in this world are not always the people who look the part. Sometimes they are, sometimes they are not. What matters is not the appearance of strength. What matters is whether the strength is real, whether it is trained, whether it is organized around something worth protecting." A year later, he was dead. 20 years later, his family needed someone. They called the person whose strength was real. They called the person whose training was genuine, however different it looked from the outside, however far it was from what people expected. They called Steven Seagal, and he answered. The full story of what happened at those meetings in 1993 has never been told publicly. The people who were in the room have kept it private out of respect for what the family was going through and out of respect for the nature of the situation. But here is what we know. The Lee family made a choice. Of all the people they could have called, all the people who were connected to Bruce's legacy, all the powerful and famous and well-connected people who would have jumped at the chance to be involved, they chose this person. They chose him because of something real, something that happened in Japan in 1972 at a dinner table that nobody photographed, nobody filmed, nobody officially documented. A 20-year-old American student of Aikido sat across from the greatest martial artist of the 20th century and showed him something genuine. And Bruce Lee saw it, and he told the young man not to let anyone teach it out of him. He didn't. He never did. And when the family needed someone, they remembered. That is why Bruce Lee's family called Seagal. That is the story they have never fully told until now. And now you know.